Hello and welcome to day 160. We are doing Ecclesiastes chapters 10 through 12, Psalm 94, and Ephesians 5. So today is our last day on Ecclesiastes, which is one of the wisdom books. And we've got 2 more days, today and tomorrow, of Ephesians, and then we'll be moving on to Philippians. After Ecclesiastes, we are going to have Song of Songs for a couple of days, and then we will be leaving the wisdom books for a while, and we will be moving to 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which overlap each other. And so we will be reading them together, and they are going to be going through the history of the kings of Israel. So we'll be looking at David and Solomon, and then all of the kings of Israel and Judah that came after that before the exile. So, finishing up Ecclesiastes, the writer has seen immaturity given prominence in different organizations. And this is definitely something that we still see happening in organizations today. Maybe it's who you know, maybe it's a money investment you have made, maybe you're just charming and charismatic, but there are many times when it seems that people who are immature get preference and leadership over people who are wise. There is still a lot of really great little bits of wisdom as we go through Ecclesiastes. For example, a dull axe makes for harder work. I'm sure any of us who have been cutting onions know how wonderful it is to have a very sharp knife so that the work goes faster. Laziness leads to disrepair. Money makes the world go round. This could be something that someone says today. Then there's some other deeper things. Be generous. Don't hoard. You won't understand the mystery of God's work, so don't even try. You will have to answer to God for your life choices. And it ends with this: fear God and do what God tells you. So much of the wisdom here is pointing us back to God's plan for humanity, ways of living together with wisdom and grace and charity and generosity, and just plain enjoying the beautiful creation that God has gifted to us. But there's always the possibility of judgment. There is the possibility that we're going to meet our Maker someday, and God will have thoughts on the choices we've made with the time, the gift that God has given us of our lives. When we go to Psalm 94, we see a psalmist who is struggling with the judgment that God can bring. Now, at the beginning, the writer is questioning God. Why do bad people get away with bad actions? And what are you doing, God? But the writer goes on to point out that God's people are a circle of blessing in the life, that faithfulness in God, even when frustrated with the realities of life, is still a blessing and brings goodness to our lives. The writer goes on to bear witness to their own faithfulness in God and that God is their safe space. So as you read 94, this is another great one to bookmark for moments when you are struggling with life. Psalm 94 is a great example of how we can be in conversation with God. We can share our anger and our frustration with God, and God listens to us. But that there is a place for faithfulness for God. There are blessings we receive from making God the center of our life. Being formed by God is important. And basically the end here is in God we will find peace that the world cannot provide. Now for Ephesians 5, we've got Paul writing to the church in Ephesus, which was a place that was a pretty busy trading center on the southwest corner of Turkey, along the Mediterranean Sea. It was pretty easy to get to Crete and Cyprus from there. There were some very large temples to Greek gods there. So Paul is really trying to reaffirm the teachings that he provided while he was visiting with the church in Ephesus. All of Paul's letters, we have to remember, are written to a specific group of people in a specific place at a specific time. And so we also have to be careful that sometimes Paul is being very specific with what he's instructing here, and it may not be a timeless truth. And whenever we're reading Paul, we have to wonder, what are the people who are getting this letter going through, and why would Paul feel the need to say this particular instruction to them at this time? Now, there's definitely a lot in Ephesians that is very timeless and that Christians for centuries have found great wisdom in and great application to their lives. So Paul is starting with be like God, learn from God, see God's love, give God's love. This is definitely a universal, timeless truth that we hear throughout the New Testament. We hear it throughout Jesus' teaching. We hear it from the prophets, and we hear it from God throughout the Old Testament. I really liked verse 4. Thanksgiving is our dialect in the translation that I am using. Our church right now is trying to live into this with the Gratitude Bag Project, where we have been collecting money through our budget to be able to buy some treats, some snacks for people in our community who work hard to keep our communities running. People like those who collect our trash and teach our children, and the district attorney's office, the public works employees of our local villages. And so we're trying to make Thanksgiving and gratitude a bigger part of our life as a church and as individuals. Paul goes on to say, don't use others for your own gain. And of course, this is something we still struggle with in the world today. There's a lot of people who manipulate others, who try to use others for their own personal gain. And this section of Ephesians really sounds a lot like Ecclesiastes. There's a list of wisdom points here that Paul is sharing. Don't be careless, watch your step, make the most of your time, sing praises to God. Now, the end of Ephesians 5 is a little bit of a tough section to read and to apply to our lives. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time going through this. It starts in verse 22 through 24, and this is a section that is often lifted up as an instruction to women for how they should be living their lives. Wives, support your husband. The husband is the leader of the home, like Christ leads the church. Now, it does end by saying that husbands should be cherishing, not domineering their wives. But it finishes with wives submit to husbands as the church submits to Christ. There are a lot of Christian traditions who have lifted this up as instruction for how marriages should work and how women should be, not just within their marriage, but even within the church, that women should be submitting to men. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is when I hear people bring this up, I often hear them skip over the section in the middle where husbands are to cherish, not dominate their wives. This section, these three verses, have often been used to create a patriarchy where men or husbands have precedence over wives and women. And I want to make sure that the middle section there is always lifted up with the rest of it. But this is not the end of Paul's instruction. Paul's instruction goes on to the end of the letter. So it continues on through verse 33. So we've got another 10 verses with some pretty clear instructions to the husbands, to the men of the household. And I do not hear people bring this up as much as I hear the phrase, wives submit to your husbands. So let's take a look at what Paul has to say in this other section. So verses 25 to 28, husbands, go all out in your love for your wives, as Christ did for the church. A love that was marked by giving, not getting. I seldom hear this section emphasized as much. He says to be one in marriage, both people, both the husband and the wife, must submit and commit to each other. Christ gave up his life for the church. That is the standard that Paul is using here when he says that husbands are like Christ in the relationship with the church. But if wives are like the church, God deliberately created the church to do God's work in the world. And the church is very important to God. So I think there is a sense of equality here, that the husbands may be like Christ, but the wives are like the church, and both are partners to do God's work in the world. Now, going on, verses 29 to 33, it says that Christ feeds and pampers us as his body, the church. There is so much written here by Paul about how husbands should treat wives and how wives should be submitting. There are many more verses here about the deep sacrifice that Christ made to the church, and calling men and husbands to live up to that same level of sacrifice and giving in their marriage relationships. So when you hear people bring this up and talk about wives submitting, I really want us to be careful with how we use this section and make sure that we use the entire section, because a lot of times this has been used to subjugate, to demean, to diminish women's role in the home and in the church. And I do not think that is at all what Paul is doing here, but it really makes me wonder what was going on in the marriage relationships in Ephesus that Paul felt that he needed to write such a long passage about the relationship between husbands and wives. So, once again, this is one of the tough passages of the Bible, and we need to prayerfully interpret this and study this and find the wisest way to apply it in our lives, making sure that we use the entire text and not just cherry pick one or two verses out of the entire instruction that Paul is giving here. Once again, the Bible is not always easy to read, but there is always some timeless truth here, inspired by God to the people of God's church. We'll see you tomorrow.